Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, or good afternoon if you're joining us from overseas. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, or any entity with which our guests might be affiliated. So today we welcome back to the Broadcast two guests who we had on almost exactly a year ago. In the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we invited Dr. Matthew Ford and Professor Andrew Hoskins onto the show to discuss their back then, it was a forthcoming book called Radical War, Data, Attention, and Control in the 21st Century, which was on the cusp of publication, and then the invasion started. The book focused on how contemporary war is legitimized, planned, fought, experienced, remembered, and forgotten in a continuous and connected way through digitally saturated fields of perception. And the war was less than a month old, and we had all spoken back then, but already it had become pretty clear that information and narrative promulgated through countless personal electronic devices and social media accounts, as well as existing official media channels, were going to be key battlegrounds in the conflict. So as the invasion approaches its 1-year mark, we welcome back Dr. Ford and Professor Hoskins, and we're expecting kind of a free-flowing discussion today. We're going to look at what elements of radical war they've seen on Ukraine's battlefields, how Russia, Ukraine, and the world at large have adapted or not adapted to leveraging the information domain, and more. And I'll note that one comment from our previous discussion that's always that has stayed with me since we talked was that I think you phrased it as this was the most mediated war that we would probably see, or at least had seen in a long, long time. And I think that has held true. If anything, it might have been even more mediated than we all sort of expected. So, gentlemen, welcome back. I want to get right to our points of discussion here, and to lead off, obviously you'd had a book that was sort of looking at the scene that was then forthcoming, and we sort of talked about initial impressions after about 3 weeks of war. So I think just jumping off here, what things that you thought you might see, did you see? What things that you expected didn't happen? What things that you didn't expect have you seen manifested on there?
So I'm going to jump in and thanks, Ian, for having us back. And it's a real pleasure to come back. You guys were the first podcast we did about the book. And I think it's fair to say both Andrew and I were, I'm speaking for Andrew, but I'm pretty confident this is the case. Both Andrew and I are going, oh God, there's a war on. And now we're going to pretty quickly find out how wrong we were about everything in radical war. And not only that, we're going to be in front of the US Marine Corps, and we better get our act together, because you folks are going to roast us alive if there's a bunch of guys who are talking about radical war and what the hell is radical war, and we're in a kinetic war, and what the hell. And so I spent that first 3 weeks before the book came out and before we came onto this show really, really working very, very hard to try and understand what kind of imagery was coming off the battlefield, what the kinds of source material that was appearing, and how I could make sense of that in the context of what we had written in terms of radical war. And I think it's fair to say, and this is why it's very nice to come back, we had spent a lot of time trying to work out how wrong we were, and I hope that what we are going to say, what we're going to agree on today, I think is that yes, there are things that might be overstated, but there's a whole heap of other things that are really understated in radical war. I think the title is definitely a provocation on our part. It's about trying to get people to think about war as a sort of not just a kinetic thing, but as an informational thing, and how they come together in one domain. And so I realize that warfighters at the moment are talking about multi-domains and having to manage life across multiple domains. But for us, that's not how we experience war. We experience war through one domain, and typically that's the smartphone that or the cell phone that is ubiquitous and is everywhere and is shaping both how we are engaging with the war, whether we're on the front lines or whether we're on the tube in London. And I think, and I'll hand over to Andrew now, but I think one of the challenges for us was to try and make sense of our book in a context where connectivity was just ubiquitous, and we're not talking just about what the armed forces think about war, but we're talking about how armed forces and society think about war, and the social structures of connectivity are framing how the armed forces are having to work. It's not that the armed forces are necessarily able to dictate everything in the information space, far from it, or that this information space is disconnected from the analog world. It's actually that they are enfolded and interrelated in a way that, it just creates all sorts of challenges in terms of how we understand and how we think about war, and how this war has actually been prosecuted, because the blurring of private and public, the blurring of analog and digital seem almost, like it's just ordinary. It's an everyday rather than something that we needed to. And I think that's what we were trying to get at in Radical War, really. Andrew.
Yes, just to echo Matthew's thanks, Ian, for inviting us back. We're delighted to be back. I think one of the big questions is, how and when do we make sense of war? And I think that's, really, really difficult question. If you think about our field roughly of the relationship between war and media, you think about kind of a number of contemporary wars. After the 1991 Gulf War, in about 93, 94, you had this loads of books coming out, talking about this new relationship between war and media. And then 2004, 2005, you had a lot published around the Iraq War and the relationship between war and media and journalism and audiences and effects and all of that. But with this war, and this is why I think our book is quite remarkable in some senses, it's really, really difficult to kind of make sense of the complexity of the relationship between digital, social media, military, war, and perception. I think to render that intelligible, I think is a real challenge. So I think that we had some kind of model that seems to hold up, we think, around the idea of ecologies, the war ecology. And, and I think to go back to that question, well, how do you make sense of this war? I'm one of the remarkable things for me is the role of Telegram. War is produced locally on Telegram and distributed by participants in a new way. And we said that in the book. We didn't really talk about Telegram in the book, but we talked about participants, all the different users, militaries, civilians, people on the ground, NGOs, all participating, as Matthew says, through their pervasive use of smartphones. So in some ways, you've got this kind of splintering, I guess, of ecologies. But the problem that I think one of the most remarkable things about this year in terms of making sense of all that is how little is actually being written and said about Telegram. So if you accept, that we're saying, well, actually, that a lot of the wars being fought out on Telegram as the most kind of used platform by Ukrainians and Russians, then why aren't we seeing it in the news? Where is it? Where's all the academics going, look at Telegram this, look at Telegram that? Well, where is it? And I think the answer to that question is because it's really difficult to understand, because a lot of it's in Russian Ukrainian. So unless you're an expert in the language and the culture, but it seems that, a lot of the coverage, a lot of the mainstream media coverage seems to miss where the real war is, and the real war, a lot of the real war and representations of it is actually, and someone just said, it's mentioned a scholar curating stuff on Telegram. I'm not saying there's no one, working on Telegram. I'm just saying that it seems to evade kind of mainstream media cultures. And, so I guess to answer one of your questions, what surprised us about the war is the ways in which the participants that we talk about in our book have exploited it appropriated it, adapted it. And the comment from the person on the chat there said about it's a treasure trove of images, and that's exactly what it is. So to come back to what I was saying at the beginning, if Matthew just let me carry on for a little bit longer, that we kind of got analysis of war 2 years, 3 years after 1991, 2 years, 3 years after 2003, name the war, name the kind of lag in kind of analysis and description and understanding. But most wars are like that. Most wars, we see the images of wars and consequences of wars and suffering and videos years later, and often not at all. Just not at all. And most wars are not, as you said at the beginning, highly mediated in this way, Ian. But, this is the most documented war in history, as we said when we last spoke with you. And that fact, I think, is extraordinary because it hasn't led to any greater real understanding or comprehension of what's going on in this war. In some ways, it's the opposite. So normally, images and videos and content, if you like, about war comes out 10 years later, 20 years later. Think about the World Wars, and the Holocaust. Think about our images and understanding of them. Some of those, especially graphic and the reality of the consequences of war, come out years and years and years later. There's no gap here. It's all there. I can go on to my computer now that I'm on with you now, and I can watch it. So where is that? Where is the reality of war? Where is it? And Matthews and I book, talked about it in exactly that way in terms of the splintering of war ecologies. That in some ways we are massively globally connected by the smartphone, yet at the same time, our realities and understandings and engagement of war is separate and splintered, and we consume it in very, very, very narrow ways. So that's a real conundrum and paradox that I think Radical War was trying to get at.
Yeah, there are other things in Radical War that we posed right at the beginning around the idea, and at least one of my war studies. I mean, one of the challenges is to bring war studies and media studies into relief with each other, into discussion with each other. Right? There's no war without its representation. Right? You've got to try and make sense of that in a. All of the OSINT stuff that's going on, they either using social media or using other, different platforms to gather up information and then promulgate it through social media. So it's either, and then they're using social media to check, to establish whether what they're seeing on the image intelligence or the satellite imagery or whatever else that the harms data, whatever else they're using, they're then running it back through and double checking through social media. So social media is a lens, but it's also a very distorting lens, and that presents us with challenges from a war studies and media studies perspective, partly because it's so immediate. And also there's a question, right? The open source intelligence people are the ones that help us in many respects understand what's going on in the campaigns, unless you've got access to classified material, and even then, it's compartmentalized, or you're seeing pictures of it that's a couple of days old, or and of course, many of the cases, people in uniform much prefer open source stuff because then at least they can use it, cite it. It becomes more useful from an everyday point of view. But the open source stuff is how we understand the world. But all of these things, that in many respects, these are sensors, right? These are the things that allow us to immediately photograph, geolocate, place in time and space a particular image. And of course, that extends. And so one of the provocations here we put in Radical War was the idea that actually the smartphone was a weapon. And of course, people in war studies side of things go, what are you talking about? It can't be. It's not a bloody weapon. It's a rifle's a weapon. A tank's a weapon. How can you call a phone a weapon? And of course, I mean, I've written a whole book on small arms innovation. So yeah, it was obviously a provocation. It was obviously a provocation. But at the same time, what was really shocking was in the first 2 or so 3 weeks were the fact that the apps had been built and sent out to allow people ordinary civilians to tag Russian columns and geolocate and photograph and then upload that stuff to Ukrainian fusion cells. And then they became part of a resilient kill chain, right? And suddenly we're like, okay, now we're not just talking about Now we're not just talking about how war is represented in terms of how we might make sense and understand, but actually people people are participating in that respect, whether they're on the front lines or on the other side of the world, amplifying or creating content. But they're also creating content actually right there. They're taking a picture of a moving column, and then they're uploading it and sending it off to an intelligence center somewhere. And what has really shocked me, I think, is firstly that this stuff was out there, right? And so, you could download the app and put in data that would help Ukrainians pinpoint Russians. The second stop was that Russians were shooting people for using their smartphones. You're like, okay, well, now we've got a really interesting feedback loop that is, seriously a massive, massive challenge to how we might think about the laws of armed conflict, about combatant status, about war crimes, about all sorts of other things. The smartphone becomes a point in that in the loop around the kill chain, and then I watched on the BBC at the beginning of the year, and there were news stories breaking in mainstream media in December or so, November, December, about how the journalists are being invited into the intelligence fusion cells and innovation cells that are in Ukraine, and they're filming it. I'm just like, okay, so I was thinking, right, at some point, someone's going to let me go and do some research. I'm going to go and see the Ukrainian army. They're going to be nice. We're going to have a good time. I'm hopefully not going to get into trouble. And people are going to look after me. And then there they are. I don't even have to do that because they're just putting it up on mainstream media. And there they are. There's the woman that's talking to the civilian because they've called it in, or they've sent an image in, or they, is the Russian still there, or is the Russian not there anymore? And then they've geolocated and tagged it, and they put it all on the telly. And I'm like, whoa, that's just remarkable. It just really blew my mind. And so when I said the smartphone as weapon, when we said the smartphone as weapon, and my war studies colleagues looked at me like, you're mad. I'm like, hold on a minute. I'm not feeling mad at all now, right? To be honest, it feels absolutely part of the kill chain. And that's so it's not just representation, it's weapons. It's war, it's kinetic.
Great. Well, this, as you guys have been talking, we've got some great questions coming in, and they tie back to some of the points you just had. So I'm just going to start weaving those in here into the discussion. But so, you talked about the war ecology, right? And so one of the questions here is, aside from the, I'm going to try to get the word right here. Yeah, the fragmentation of people in different parts of that ecology, especially like sort of if there's a war ecology, there's an information ecology and ecosystems within that. So the question here is that this has not, I think, made the English-speaking media all that much, but the questioner points out that in non-English speaking and in different parts of the globe, there are different media ecologies at play, and that a lot of the narratives going into those non-English media ecologies in different, like South America or Africa, I think is a place where this is quite prevalent, tend to be either ambivalent about what is going on, who's in the right, who's not, or more directly, supportive of the Russian position. So I'm assuming you gentlemen have probably seen some of this or studied some of it. So, what's your perspectives on this? And is there anything that can be done to counter these narratives, or have we sort of unintentionally seeded those spaces?
One thing that really was fascinating early on, in about April or May last year, someone had done some crunching. I know the team who were involved in doing it, and done some crunching just to see who the social media influencers were and how they were working in terms of geography. And it was pretty clear that Western mainstream social media was being owned by from a Ukrainian information. It was a Ukrainian information space, basically, but they were having no pull through into, or not as much pull through into the social media space in South America, in Africa, in South Africa, in India. Clearly not in China. Some of that is splinternet related. Some of that's Great Firewall of China related. Some of that's language related. But also, it seems that there's a degree of campaign, social media campaign going on from the Russian side of things, which is about shaping the information space outside of the West, and that's clearly complicating international politics when it comes to managing the relationship between the world at large and Russia. and sanctions and all this other stuff. I mean, it's the grain and energy can be used as a weapon by the Russians in order to shape politics in other parts of the world, the Middle East, in North Africa, whatever, is helpful for the Russians in terms of also then giving them some hooks for pushing on their narratives. What I do know is that from having been to a couple of conferences subsequently, that the Ukrainian information campaign, certainly at the beginning, was really challenged by not knowing how many bombs were going to land over Kiev and whether they have an office. And so, moving virtually, having to work 18 hours a day, having to build campaigns on the fly, only having 20 or so people to drive the Stand With Ukraine hashtag. All of that constrains the capacity to get messages out there. But I know subsequently, at the same time, that a number of outreach efforts have been put in place, partly by the US State Department, partly by other embassies around the world, to try and open up a forum for discussions about the war in Ukraine that then are trying to seed the possibility locally and influence the local mainstream media, and maybe even get to a point where you can bring influencers into those discussions and influence local social media conversations that are about trying to promote re-engagement with Ukraine, rather than just automatically assuming that Russian media messages are the right ones to take. So there are things going on at a sort of PR level, at a government level, to try and shape narrative. I do wonder, I suppose the question in radical war terms is the extent to which how manipulable is all of this in the context of billions of users who are engaging and participating and have their own perspectives, framings, and ways of thinking about the war, given what Andrew was talking about in terms of a splintering of realities. How do you manage some of those narratives in this context where social media is a distorting prism, full stop? It's designed as a distorting prism principally because it aids marketers who want you to buy things, or has a different set of policies or structures that shape the way conversations happen, and the openness in which conversations happen as well.
I mean, I will add that, in the book we do write about different ecologies. We obviously talk about Myanmar and how different social media platforms and networks, are used in different ways in very different parts of the world. So, we can't assume that there's some kind of blanket understanding and use or abuse of a particular technology or particular platform in a particular country. They're all very, very different, introduced at different times, to very different cultures. And so, we often talk about this kind of globalized social media world, and it's nothing like that at all. And that's, I think, one of the great points about our book. I mean, what I will say is that in terms of the adaptation and exploitation of social media over time, the Russian information war started off, it was rubbish. It was basically an old man on TV. It wasn't much more than that. It really wasn't. You can talk. There's a lot of stuff being written about how Russians were doing cyber war this, cyber war that, and actually they weren't very good. And you can tell they weren't very good because of the response by Russian civil society that adapted and exploited Telegram. So, what you've got now is several hundred Russian channels on Telegram that have filled the vacuum that were left by the traditional state-run influence mainstream media. And these are bloggers, they're independent reporters, they are, of course, some Russian Ministry of Defense accredited reporters, established and well-known journalists, people from the front line. There's several hundred of these channels now, Russian channels on Telegram. And they're not all completely, mad disinformation pro-Russian. Some of them are, somewhere in the middle, much more critical of what the Russian state are doing. But what that tells you, what that emergent exploitation of Telegram tells you by Russian civil society, is a response to a recognition of just how rubbish Russian information warfare was, especially in comparison with Ukraine's.
So actually, one of the notes I had down here was exploring the Telegram piece a little bit more because, I'll confess, before the war started, never heard of Telegram, right? And then I think we had a number of folks to include, Dr. Weber on our separate program, sort of filling in the background of, yes, it's become it's a very popular, widely used application, especially for Russian Ukrainians. But one of the sort of, as you just mentioned, one of the themes has been the Telegram channels have turned into places where some of the most critical commentary from Russians about Russian performance in the war have come.
Mhm.
And one of our sort of enduring segments on the program with Yuval is like, what bonkers stuff is like Russian state media saying on any given day?
Yeah.
From saying it'd be okay if they all got nuked because they were going to go to heaven because this is a holy war, to there was a recent one where one of their regular anchors was like on camera yelling at his technical staff because they hadn't set up like the background properly. But it's bizarre and bonkers. I don't really know how to describe it, but there's definite tension. Like the most critical parts of Russian military performance are coming from these Telegram channels. So if maybe both of you could expand on why or how have these critical Telegram channels been allowed to continue? Because it's not like Putin's ever been shy about cutting off access or forcing media folks out in the cold, if they annoy him. But also what I think the perception before the war, and as our guest here, calling in from Istanbul, again, great to have folks from around the globe in here. Be made a point in the chat here that Russia ran a pretty effective information campaign via Turkish media that directly led to the acquisition of Russian air defense, right? So that's an effective informational campaign. What happened? Like where they used to be, Russia is seen as extremely effective, even superior in this realm, and it's changed or it's collapsed or however you want to call it, but it's not nearly as good as we all sort of perceived it to be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there was an assumption that I don't know who was assuming the effectiveness of Russian information war. I mean, that was kind of a myth anyway, really. Perhaps they kind of fell for it in effect to some extent themselves. But Telegram, I mean, Russia did try and shut it down actually a few years ago. So it was actually kind of banned for a while. But the reason it continues, the reason the Ukrainians and the Russians still let Telegram continue is because it serves both their interests. And it's a very, very simple platform to use. It's very accessible. It's not, there's few algorithms on it, but it's not really algorithmically driven. So in terms of anyone can set up a channel, I can set up a channel today, tomorrow. So in some ways, when I talk to colleagues and friends in Ukraine on WhatsApp, they say, "Oh, don't use WhatsApp, use Telegram," because that's the kind of default go-to communication tool in Russia. And I don't know, it's about 80% of Ukrainians use it. At least a third of Russians use it, something like that. I think those numbers have gone up. They're probably a bit out of date, but what's happened is that all those people who were on multiple different platforms before, including those in mainstream media and on all other kinds of messaging platforms, migrated to Telegram because it's just so simple to use and everyone else was on it. So it's kind of like sucked everybody in. And those people, those individuals who are not really commenting about the war, or you would not be seen as, typically people who would get involved in the politics or the military, all kind of turned. So in Ukraine, you've got lots of bloggers, young bloggers who used to blog about literature and poetry, very young people blogging about normal stuff. The war comes along and people migrate to Telegram and it becomes this new battleground. It's a very, very curious platform in some ways. And I think we the West don't really understand it because we have this debate all the time about how to moderate, how to regulate, how to censor social media platforms to protect, for good reasons, to push away hate speech, to protect young children from abuse, and all the good reasons. And we have those debates all the time, at Facebook and just trying to own TikTok and all of this. But actually, you know, while we're over here having these debates, the world is burning on Telegram. You know, it's astonishing. I still, you know, Matthew and I have these talks all the time, and I say to him, I still can't get my head round, you know, why there's this. Maybe it's what I said at the beginning. Maybe it is about language and culture, and you know, it's something that is much more resistant to people whose first language is traditionally English, English academics. Maybe it is a bit more resistant to their kind of analyses and comparisons, but it seems to be very invisible in a lot of kind of westernized coverage of what's going on. But it seems to be the go-to place for many Ukrainians and many Russians to either engage with this war or to understand what's going on in this war. And that includes absolutely families, parents, relations of those who are captured, killed and wounded in this war. And, you know, and from the very beginning, and again, you know, it's Ukrainians leading here, Ukrainian information officer might have mentioned this when we last spoke, you know, at the very beginning. They set up their look for your own channel, didn't they? Right at the very beginning of the war, look for your own channel. And this channel, set up by the Ukrainian Information Ministry, showed images of wounded and dead, presumably mostly Russian soldiers, basically saying to Russians, you know, Russian parents, Russian mothers, Russian families, you know, we've got, look at this. And a lot of those images and photographs and videos had them holding up passports, you know, again, you know, what's extraordinary and unusual about this war is how the combatants have been identified by both sides. And of course, the Russians then followed with copycat channels, you know, again, you know, exploiting, you know, and for me, well, not just for me, you don't need to be me to see this, you know, much of those channels are kind of breaches, you know, of the Geneva Convention, if not other rules of war and law, international humanitarian law, and it's just shocking, you know. So I'm not saying I'm pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian here. I'm just saying both sides, you know, it's there to be seen, and I've written about it in an article called "The War Feed." You know, this stuff's in your feed if you want to see it, yeah. But most normal people, you know, why, you know, don't want to see it. So again, Matthew and I, you know, in Radical War talk about this splintering of perception, you know, this radically separating of ecologies of perception and engagement with war, and that seems to me to have become, you know, even more ingrained, even more you know, these ecologies seem even more kind of separated up in terms of perception and engagement with war. And you know, and one more point, and then I'll shut up, Matthew. Sorry. You know, one thing that can be said about this war is that in the UK terms, at least, which obviously Matthew and I are familiar with, and after a month, news audience interest just dropped off a cliff. Okay, so again, another paradox of radical war is this sense you've got the most documented war in history, and I challenge anyone to argue with me about that point. This is the most documented war in history, and we can give you facts and figures and stats and boy with those if you like, and yet it's not engaging audiences in you know, for many reasons, of course, not just about overload, but the paradox is it's in some ways the most available stuff of actual images and videos and messages from the battlefield in real time all of the time, and yet, you know, it seems very ignored and very forgotten already.
I suppose that one question that you might want to ask is why is that, and why does stuff? How? There's a practical question about how stuff like that ends up on Western mainstream social media. You know, how does it, and why that particular image, or why? And so this is when it becomes really important And that's what I spent a lot of time doing in the before the podcast we did a year ago. It becomes really important checking on the provenance of the sources that you're looking at, and understanding what is headcam footage, what's webcam footage, what's smartphone footage, what's mainstream media footage, what platform is it originated on, and is it edited? How is it edited? Who's involved in the editing? And you can start to, one of the things that was really intriguing was the speed at which different source materials would emerge online. So, some material would get held back, and then you go, well, there's that implies there's someone actually managing the media space, right? And the Ukrainians, pretty quickly it became clear that the Ukrainians were holding that stuff back, and that gave their own media teams, information ops people, to opportunity to try and shape messages and then convey the stories that they wanted. And in the melange and mess of the kickabout of social media and mainstream media, and what messages would appear in what different war ecologies, what different information spaces, that try to create some leverage and some space, and you can see that manipulation was going on. So if you wait 48 hours for a tank or an image of a tank to be pulled off the battlefield, who's involved in that? And you have to think about that question, I think. The other thing to think about is what platforms are these images turning up on, and where and why? So a lot of materials on Telegram, but then how does it get off Telegram and end up somewhere else? Now, some of that's just easy. Someone's ripped the image, put it on recontextualized it, shoved it on mainstream social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, right? But what happens when things are really complicated? So, to picking up Andrew's point about identifying a Russian soldier with the passport and taking a picture and shoving it on Telegram, I was getting images I was getting video feed on my social media, on my Twitter timeline. An anonymous account had posted a video of a Ukrainian calling a Russian mum to tell her that her child had been killed in Ukraine. And okay, so I don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. I didn't know what's going on. I happen to know Ian Garner. I gave him a call, and he said, I asked him, is this as gruesome as it looks? And he said, yes, it is gruesome. It's pretty nasty stuff. And I was like, okay, right. Well, okay. First off, we know the content, it could be staged, but we know that there's something in the language, in the content, and the rest of it. Then I ask another friend to tag the metadata and where does it come from? And initially the feedback was it had come from Russia. It hadn't come from Ukraine. It come from Russia. It come from Russia, gone through China, and ended up in India. Got picked up on a Reddit board in India, then got posted anonymously, tagged to me. And I'm like, okay, so now the question is, why am I getting tagged, right? What is it that says that I have some particular reason to get targeted here in this great big mess that is social media, and there are millions of posts coming out and lots of different, I was lucky. I know a couple of people who firstly speak Russian, Ukrainian, and then I know someone who's prepared to do some legwork just to do some tracing metadata across multiple platforms. But the majority of people are neither interested nor have the skills nor the time to do any of that, to just double check before they hit the repost on their social media feed. And that is precisely where you get this accelerating and decelerating discourses that become really problematic. And you get this, Telegram, I think, is probably very useful in that, there's a sort of, it's a linear kind of way of engaging with the feed, right? But if you're on any other social media feed, you kind of get there's a asynchronicity of it associated with it. You things drop in and drop out. You don't know the logical sequence or the causal sequence of events. And so, the result is that people become, to go back to what Andrew's saying, there's a sort of disengagement. How do I make sense of this? Because I can't see, and the people become skeptical. And I remember early on in the war, running an event at my old university, Sussex University, to encourage a student open day, and they brought their parents along. And I asked them all in this workshop, how do they get their news? And the kids are on TikTok, or they're on some of them are rarely on the old farts platform, Twitter. But they're if they're really unlucky, they're on Facebook. But they're not. They might be on Insta. They're definitely using Snapchat. They're using WhatsApp. They're all this other stuff. but their parents, they're maybe on Facebook, right, and they might be on Twitter, and then they're reading, then they're watching the CNNs and the BBCs and the Al Jazeeras and the rest of it. Their grandparents, the kids' grandparents, they're reading mainstream media as what I'm trying to say, is newspapers, right? As physical newspapers, right? That's where they get their news feeds from, right? Their war feed. And in this kind of, one of the challenges here is to sort of try and pull apart these different layers of the new war ecology or new war ecologies, because one of the things that we were making a point in Radical War is there's not just one war ecology, there are multiple. They reflect the information infrastructures that are in different geographies, but they also reflect the different media cultures that exist in and the historical trajectories of those media cultures in those particular parts of the world. If you're in various parts of Africa, you're not using a fixed line telecommunications platform. You're using cell phones, and that complete. You're even using your smartphone to shift money about the place, and you're using your smartphone to pay for things. And of course, the smartphone becomes a center of the kind of ecologies around which you experience and engage the world. But you've got to map that in against different generations, different demographic profiles, different geographical spaces, different parts of the world using infrastructure in a different way. And I think that has definitely, from just watching the war in Ukraine, and I went to a really interesting workshop the other day where we were listening to people talking about the new war ecologies in different parts of the world, in Mali, in Somalia, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, how digitization is affecting conflict and war, and framing how people engage with the war in those locations. And what it seems to me is that when you look at Ukraine, everything's accelerated and amplified, and it's like bam, it's straight there, and the cacophony that it creates. Even now that the Ukrainian government has moved up into the cloud to access Ukrainian government services, the choices are when it comes to your electricity is to turn the light on, to put some food, to heat up some food, or to power up your phone, right? Your world is starting to shift because that connectivity is just there, and you need it, and that's how you remain engaged and even able to pay or access services that your life otherwise depends on. Because that's how everyone lives. It's not just, and in that respect, I suppose the one thing that the regular comment that I would get before Radical War came on was that connectivity, that's not something that is not ubiquitous. That's not ubiquitous, and people could not be further. People's mental maps of how connected the world is like something stuck around 2000 or something, because literally everywhere is connected, and anyone who thinks it's not connected, well, those parts of the world you don't actually want to be connected to, because they're up a mountain or in a swamp or they're in a part of the world. And go get this, if you're not connected to the grid, you're still influenced by it, whether you like it or not, right? Because all the journalists are connected to the grid, and all the mainstream news people are connected to the grid. And if, like Osama bin Laden, you think you can get away with being off the grid, well, go figure. Americans figure out that you're off the grid, and then you get it anyway. So, there's no chance that you can get off the grid, because life is basically lived through this digital experience. It's not an analog digital thing. They are totally enfolded in and of each other. And that's why when, warfighters talk about domains, we understand that that's about trying to organize different parts of the military in order to orchestrate fires, maneuver, logistics, engage different bits of the cyber capability to rest of it. But that's not how the rest of the world lives. The rest of the world does not live through domains. It lives through its smartphone. And I think that's kind of the thing that really strikes home when it comes to thinking about Radical War and the war in Ukraine. People are not switching the web off. They are definitely not switching. Why don't we just switch it off? Well, I'll tell you why. Because life depends on the web. If you need to have it, you're actively engaged with it, and you can't avoid it. And that goes for the armed forces that are relying on Elon Musk, and it goes for the civilians who are using the Elon Musk's the low orbital satellites to to get online and talk to their families in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world. It's useful for targeting and for engaging in war fighting, just like it is for everyone to communicate. It's just part of the everyday fabric of what war is.
Yeah, and I have a note here to myself about exactly that, Elon Musk and Starlink. We'll see if I got time to get back to it. But I want to go back to something that Andrew said there in terms of, things that from a, maybe a Western military governmental perspective bleed over across laws of armed conflict and aspects like the Geneva Convention. And you mentioned one in terms of the phone call to the Russian mother, right, saying, "Hey, here's a picture of your son and his passport where he's died." The Geneva Convention has some fairly specific things to say about the photography of casualties or prisoners of war. But so that in mind, in the chat here, a couple questions that are sort of tied together that I want to go into, that not so much in the combatants now, but in terms of the overall participants, that you both mentioned. First part of this is that there seems to be in the West, especially, maybe not especially, but as opposed to what is socially acceptable in terms of discussing and viewing on our social media channels, in comparison to wars in Iraq, Iran, Syria, where like you would blur stuff out, or like you don't want to share it, right, because you're doing ISIS's work for you by sharing the horrible things that they're posting out there. And he mentions that first point is that it now seems to be socially acceptable, at least in the digital realm, to repost these things and sometimes joke about it or make offhanded comments. He goes on to tie into it's another turret throwing contest competitor, right? Early days in the war, there were a lot of very proliferated and high resolution images of Russian tank turrets flying off, because the way their autoloader is configured, you hit that and set off the ammunition, it blows turret off the tank, right? And that turned into sort of, like it says, a competition or a contest. And then there's, I see pretty regularly images of the UASs, dropping ordnance, not sometimes on tanks, but also on top of Russian positions that they obviously don't know it's there. And some of the comments like, oh, after all this time, they still haven't figured out how to sort of do, camouflage concealment from the air, a bunch of dummies. And you're sort of like, okay, from a tactical perspective, maybe that's true, but you also just watch, some person or a group of people get like fragged, right, in real time. Why do you think this social, what's become acceptable has shifted in this specific conflict when we're not that far removed, from ISIS, for example? And then what does it say? I guess, what does it say about us in terms of our consumption and direct participation in it? Is there a coping mechanism at work, or is perhaps there's, we're not psychologists here, but is there maybe some other, I don't know, a mental or social contagion that makes people not just actively seek this stuff, but comment and joke about it?
I think it's a really good question, and I think you need to distinguish between where you see it. So we still have a mainstream media, roughly, including mainstream social media to some extent. But most of that, if you think about events that have captured the kind of global imagination, the massacre at Bucha, okay, Western mainstream media showed, covered over bodies, maybe a few bits of blood, nothing really, have a terrible and awful and shocking. The incident was, the massacre was, it was pretty highly sanitized, highly censored footage, because most television audiences in the West just don't want to see that. The realities, the blooded realities and abuse of war, and that stuff will never, virtually never be shown on Western television. There's something about Western mainstream media that is still really highly censored, highly sanitized. And let me give you an example of that extreme sensitivity, to anything that's not, I mean, television in particular. So, a few years ago, if you remember the Super Bowl, was it Janet Jackson's nipple was exposed live on prime time American television? America went mad. This is awful. Look, our children saw this. This is outrageous. So it's not about what is being seen. It's about where it's being seen and expectations about where it's being seen. So there are still, certain parts of mainstream media which will never ever show the horrific realities of warfare, because if they did, they would lose their audiences. News is a business ultimately. We talk about they are splintered realities. So your question, Ian, is well, what about those people who do watch this kind of stuff? And well, okay, that I guess you might argue that there's some inuring, there's some kind of getting used to images of abuse, and but I still think there's a mainstream sensitivity amongst certain audiences. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Most of us do not want to see images of human abuse and suffering and death. Of course, we'd be mad if we wanted to see that. But the extent to which, though, that kind of penetrates and it filters into our social media feeds is a different question. And whether that's having some effect, I'm not sure. But certainly what you can say is that, the stuff that's on Telegram is, will just break every regulation and rule that has ever been invented about media representation of conflict or of abuse. That's absolutely can be said. And yes, of course, on many of these channels, you've got individuals celebrating and cheering and putting emojis, clapping, applauding death and applauding abuse. But that is something else. That's psychological war. So there's psychological war on Telegram, absolutely. And then over here, you've got a very highly sanitized representation or bits of that might enter into some social media platforms, okay. And when you see it on Twitter, it's you see a tweet and it says content censored in the image below, so there are still many filters. So we have this impression that the world is open, that social media gives us this panacea. We're watching the reality of war all the time in real time, and we are, if we want to, but most people are not. They don't want to see that, and why should they? And so again, we've got this paradox, and that's radical war. We've got the most documented, evidence-based stream of images and video and testimony and the horrors of war that we've never ever experienced in real time, and never experienced in this quantity of volume ever. Compared to all the wars in history before this. These are grand claims, but they hold up. And yet, and this comes to one of the questions in the chat, our perception of war is still completely guided with the kinds of how we filter our digital feeds, what we subscribe to and what we don't. And so this extraordinary paradox is split between this astonishing volume of stuff and our capacity to render it intelligible or to seek it out, or rather not to seek it out.
And our mental models are kind of I think that's why, I suppose, one of the reasons why we called it radical war is because there's in our minds we need to have a real break with framings that are pre-digital, that sort of seeped into the digital and continue to sort of shape how we think about things in a digital, when I know we might even go so far as to say this is post-digital. This is just how the world is, right? And that demands a framing that allows us to engage with those practical realities where, as I said, there are older people still reading the newspaper, physically reading a paper newspaper. There are other demographics where they're watching the telly and maybe on Facebook, and there are another bunch of people who are on all sorts of social media platforms. And then there are those who are saying, no, I'm not involved in any of this, and I don't even have a smartphone, and they think that they're not even on the grid at all. And of course, they're still engaged with the way the world is in terms of its digital, its contemporary framing, because they can't avoid it. And that goes I'm trying to draw it. I will try to draw it back to war a little bit. That goes also for how our mental models work in relation to kinetic stuff as well, because the digital and the kinetic are immediately and sometimes very viscerally and sometimes very directly linked. Someone's filming something, it's broadcast live somewhere, the outgoing shells on an artillery piece, and you then see on the other end of it some artillery shells being returned fire. Now, what's the feedback loop between someone broadcasting and the other guy spotting that the is it that they're watching the telly, or is it that they're listening to this the artillery sounds going out, the outgoing fire, and have located the fire on the basis of the artillery sound? How do we know? These feedback loops are all over the place, and they're kind of, and it's really astonishing. You can't, you say, well, most people in uniform don't really think much in the OSINT is its own space that you have to be very wary of, and you can see that social media more broadly is a cesspit, as one of my intelligence chums would describe. It's full of all of this stuff that Andrew was talking about that just sort of is there to push your thinking down one line of investigation, and you really need some kind of AI or some kind of means for scraping the data and then looking at the metadata and then synthesizing that, looking for patterns and identifying who's driving the debate. And sometimes you might see you might use that to at least be able to understand where people are on the battlefield. There's companies, there are different companies, Anomaly 6 is the one I'm thinking of, that has said that they can take people's smartphones, track everyone individually, de-anonymize the smartphone so that they can see who you are, and then they can look at your social media feed so they can see what you're seeing, see what you're thinking, see where you are, and if you post an image, they can see where what you're looking at, and they can do that in real time. Okay, wow, that's we have, when you connect that up to warfighting capabilities, you might say that, well, that's revolutionizing how we're doing things, but there's still this kind of representation challenge, right? Where it's not just a data thing, it's also a context, it's also a human understanding thing. That how do we if you're not at the center of the eye manipulating everything in some Machiavellian sense of the word, some homunculus, how are you trying to, how is the rest of us going to try and make sense of that? I mean, and dare I say, even if you're at the center of things, how are you supposed to make sense of it, right? What feed is more important than another? How do you combine all of that? How do you do it all at speed? It just boggles the mind, in my mind, that we can make some claims about warfighting when we can't think about how we might make sense of the world, given that the vast majority of people are not involved in targeting or not involved in all sorts of other bits and pieces. They're after all the people that are going to start shaping the politics and discussions and how they understand and how whether we should commit forces to do one thing or whether we should pay more money on defense or all sorts of things. So we have to pay attention to how narrative construction is working in this difficult space, even if people somehow feel that they've got the data to have this sort of all-seeing eye, which which is what the big tech companies are trying to tell us, right? That's what they want to tell us. They want you to buy. They want you to believe that they've got a picture on everything and can see everything and know everything. Well, but that doesn't help people and their own understanding of their particular context and location and space and their media feed.
Great. So speaking of big tech companies, I did want to come back and I made a note about Starlink before, but this kind of jumps into what you were just talking about in terms of the a pre-digital age, or this perspective that we can isolate certain domains when we sort of really can't. So obviously the uses of Starlink, a civilian satellite constellation which has been enabled, broadband internet and enabled communication across large parts of Ukraine, especially, that with other communication infrastructure damage, that's been how they've been able to communicate. But that communication has been not it doesn't fit in one narrow lane, right? It's been used for, as far as I know, for basic civilian communication, early warning for incoming Russian missile strikes, but also to, coordinate military operations on the Ukrainian side, because again, that's the infrastructure they have, right? There's stuff locally may have been destroyed, or they may just not have enough of sort of conventional military communications hardware. So Starlink has been the backup. And, obviously recently the head of Starlink, and then sort of, backed up by Elon Musk, noted that there were going to be some constraints put on the usage of that because it was, I may be paraphrasing, but, we don't want to help start World War III. Does this reflect, what is the I don't want, it's not even dual use. The multi-use of Starlink now has been, I don't think, something we've seen on any previous battlefield. Do we understand really what the implications of that asset that anybody can tie into are? Do we understand that yet? And also, do you think that the notion that, we'll try and compartmentalize it for one use case, but we're going to take away from the other, it's a big tech company, and obviously like Starlink this is like unprecedented advanced 21st century technology that a private tech company has put up there, and now it's a piece of battlefield C2 architecture. But does their public comments, does that indicate that maybe they don't even realize that they can't break it into different domains for how it's used, that like that's simply not an option in this day and age?
So first up, I think that it tells us that it implies to me that that we are very much in a world where splinter nets, the platforms, the internet itself, how you might firewall things. Great Firewall of China. Well, if you park a load of satellites, Elon Musk satellites over China and beam, and you find a way of bringing in the receivers on the other end, how does China control by jamming the signal, I guess. You can see the kind of variety of sets of additional challenges that are presented by having different platforms up in space that are able to help people connect, that I think sort of tell us something about how connectivity and people's engagement with the world will work in the future. Because you log onto this network, you get this kind of feed. You log onto that network, you get this other kind of feed. And actually, it's important that you're on the right network, because on some networks you have to say what you like, and on other networks you have to be really careful about what you say. And that's sort of getting hardwired, as it were, into the ecosystem. So that strikes me as being one thing. The other thing is that I wonder whether governments actually have the capacity to do what Musk has done. It seems Musk has got this great platform out there. I wonder, the private sector is leading the way here in a way that I wonder whether the public sector would even have an interest, or would know how to recruit the right kinds of people to be able to put the platform together quickly, and then jam counter Russian cyber activities to try and hack would you have the capability to do that quickly? I don't know. And it's the last point I was going to say was that it seems to me that there's a whole series of private sector technologies that have just been hacked and reworked for military purposes, that demonstrates a creativity in using ubiquitous connected technologies for warfighting that are way ahead of and beyond the way Western armed forces have been thinking about how they should innovate military tech. So on the one hand, I think there's sort of splinter nets are going to here to stay, and that's going to complicate narrative management, and it's going to complicate how how governments may or may not control messages. The other end of it is the ubiquity of some of these devices just tells me that you're using Android software operating system to do your target management acquisition, and that's just amazing, it seems to me, and doing it without the support of big tech or any of that stuff. Wow, I mean, that's really creative stuff.
I mean, certainly the military industrial complex has kind of gone rogue, but still in many cases you've still got private individuals and platforms and owners that obviously invest in this stuff and share their technologies. Their technologies get appropriated and used for wars, as we've seen with Starlink, and then they want to wrest it back and all of that. But what's really interesting then is, well, if you look at, I think Telegram's kind of a gap. It doesn't fit the model of I'm not saying people aren't making money out of it as a platform, but it doesn't fit the same model that we've come to understand in terms of private technology firms investing in particular forms of technology which have then been appropriated or sold or used for military as well as civilian use, and then blurred the two. So Telegram seems to it's like a gap. And perhaps that is why it kind of sits outside of our more traditional modes of analysis about the relationship between the Pentagon and big tech and obviously military companies in the States and elsewhere. So there's something that I think really interesting there about, have we seen the breaking of, if you like, of the military industrial complex, the breaking of the social, what then became the social media military complex into something different, and Matthews, was there talking about kind of the splinter nets and this fragmentation, but it seems to me that Telegram kind of defies some of our assumptions about those relationships that we've traditionally understood as producing certain types of tech, certain types of weapons, certain types of established relationships between military and private companies.
All right, thank you both. So we're past an hour here, and I could honestly continue this discussion probably for another hour, not even blink. But I do want to make sure we're honoring everybody's time. So I'll throw out one last question to both of you gentlemen, and then we'll wrap it up here. So we're coming up on the 1 year mark of the war. We talked shortly after it started. We're talking here. I think the general hope is that this is not extended significantly for another year, but who knows, right? But as we get past the 1 year mark, for how much longer it goes on, what are some of the things that either of you are going to be sort of watching most closely in this I want to say it's not just one space, it's multiple spaces, but themes, trends you'll be watching to sort of see how they develop over the next year?
That is a really good question, and it's not a question I have actually thought through an answer to. I think partly because I've been so shocked about what's actually gone on, and I've been using Radical War as a reference point. And I think probably it's fine having Radical War as a point of departure, but I definitely suspect we need to move beyond Radical War fairly quickly. I mean, some of the things that I think might be worth thinking through is how what we were observing in Ukraine manifests in other parts of the world in terms of the technologies, ways of thinking, platforms, all the rest of it, and how that works. Because the war is not just Ukraine. War is in a lot of different places, and we kind of got to be attentive to how some of the things that have happened in Ukraine then rework their way back into the war ecologies elsewhere. So that is definitely a question in my mind. I suppose the other thing is there are things around how Russians and Ukrainians engage with their media platforms that what I think I've observed is that things have got more channelized. On the one hand, there's a lot more material out there, and it's very hard to make sense of. And yet, at the same time, if you're very closely watching, the types of material sort of gets narrowed to different types of the provenance of the images appear in a sort of same kind of way or style, and you've got to pay very close attention to the information ecology. What's getting switched off? What's getting switched on? And why, and under what circumstances. You've got to get really close to the feeds. And I think actually that's what is being, at the beginning, you could take big, broad handfuls of stuff because operational security wasn't there necessarily, or people were learning to deal with the new context. And as the war's gone on, people's engagement with the information has changed, and you've got to be even more closely attentive to pick up the nuances, and there are nuances in there. And I think that demands even more attention that I think probably is precisely why one of the many reasons why people are getting turned off or switch off, because they don't have the time, the energy, or the interest in actually paying close attention. And that's what this war is really demanding.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks again for hosting us. So just very briefly, my question is, will the most documented war in history make any difference at all to the pursuit of the prosecution of war crimes? So we've got the most amazing, astonishing accumulation of millions of images that, as I've said, breach the Geneva Convention and breach, international humanitarian law, and that are absolutely unprecedented in their volume and availability. Now, will that lead to the pursuit and prosecution of war crimes against those people responsible, or will it increase the probability of that happening compared to other wars in history? And my answer to that, is obviously speculative, is no, it won't. And we hear about the Berkeley Protocol, we hear about great NGOs like Eyewitness who are developing tech and protocols for capturing evidence so that it can be used in the future. Mnemonics do fantastic work gathering and collecting millions and millions and millions of records of potential abuse and war crimes. And I am very skeptical, however good these groups are, and they're wonderful people, believe me, and I really support their work. But I'm ultimately skeptical that volume, that scale of material will actually make a fundamental difference to the potential and the capacity for the pursuit of war crimes or other breaches of human rights and so on in times of war.
That's a very interesting point to dwell on, and it's kind of sad. But this this sort of echoes a previous guest we had on last summer, I think. But Dr. Joanna Siquiera, who does international law, specifically, some looking at human rights abuses and war crimes, and that was kind of her assessment too. Like, we have the laws and we can collect the evidence, but actually, bringing prosecution and bringing, justice in the end for the many victims out there. I think she called it. I think she called the framework fragile and leaky, and a couple of other things. And it's a huge.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately a big challenge, and it's really kind of depressing to think that even with all this evidence, some of the perpetrators, some if not a majority, may get to live to the end of their days without having to, do any receive any punishment or atonement for what they've done. So yeah, but I don't know. Maybe I'd like to be optimistic and say maybe the sheer volume of data will make a difference. But yeah, I don't know. It's one thing to have the evidence, and it's another to actually, get the people, put them in front of a court and prosecute and then punish.
And pay for it and resource it and have the political will to do it.
Yeah, and to the point of people turning out, that's a big challenge. Right? Like all this data, but if people are tuning it out, what is the interest going to be in terms of prosecution?
And the data, and to be really sharp about it, Clearview AI makes itself available to Ukraine, but not to Russia. So Clearview AI allows Ukrainians to scan people's faces and then open up their smartphones and then download all that stuff, so you can see where the Russians have been and what they've done and all the rest of it. But they're not providing that technology to the Russians, right? And under those circumstances, at what point, if you're not making that crucial technology available to all sides, then you're not interested in law, as in in laws of armed conflict, as a question about law. You're actually sort of taking sides right at the get-go. And I think, what you're seeing then is that when I said something about spinternets, or when we have talked, Andrew and I, about spinternets, or rest of it, the sort of a big fissure in the technology world, and there's a decoupling, and that decoupling between Russia and the West, between China and the rest, that is getting embedded in the technologies that we've got all around us. And that is even when we get to international law, we are not going to, what works in terms of prosecutions in the West is going to be completely, it's already a political football. It's being politicized. It's going to continue to be politicized. There is no way of escaping. And dare I say, even online social media, what are the chances of having an objective war crimes tribunal in a context where everyone has got completely different views about what's going on in the war rather, and who's committing atrocities and under what circumstances? It doesn't bode well at all, I don't think, for taking any of this forwards. That's a real. I think I definitely agree with Andrew. That's a real and fundamental shift, and we need to figure out ways of accommodating ourselves to that.
Yeah, I think to the the framework of how you select a jury pool, right? Like you're supposed to be able to say you can be relatively impartial. How can anybody say that, at this point, a year in, and even if you've been sort of a more casual consumer?
I mean, the narratives here are shaping how people fight wars, even when so troops don't know what the laws are. There's something online, and already it's shaping how people behave when they're on the battlefield. Just because someone's made out an assertion about what the laws of armed conflict are, whether it's based in any reality or not, doesn't matter. It's still having effects on how people engage, and that's there's what lawyers say, and then there's how people are, and there's going to be some reconciling that is going to be very challenging. It already is, I think.
Well, it's certainly something we probably won't be revisiting until longer down the road when I don't know if the conflict over, but is it a point where you can start talking about the application of international law and the prosecution of war crimes? Something to be watched. And I think we share a relatively bleak assessment of how that's going to go. Be nice to be proven wrong. So something to watch here in not the near term, but down the road, definitely. All right. Well, wow, we're almost 90 minutes in here, so I think we'll end it on that note. Not always a happy note we ended on, but it's not a happy situation. So sometimes we just have to accept it for what it is. So to Matthew Ford and Andrew Hoskins again, great to have you back. Appreciate you coordinating from multiple time zones. Matthew, I'd forgotten you were in Sweden, but thanks for jumping in here for a second episode. And I look forward to getting this one out. And I think we had a very good discussion here. So to our audience as well, thanks for joining us and sticking with us here. If you stuck with us to the 90-minute mark, Team Krulak's going to be off next week, at least, for some travel and some other activities. But we'll be back here in March. I've already got some good stuff lined up for the March schedule of the Brewcast. So make sure you're following us on all of our social media channels to get the registration information. And then we'll also have another Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War with Dr. Yuval Weber brewing here, hopefully out within the next week at least, talk about the state of the war as we approach again the 1 year mark. So again, thank you all very much, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.